I never liked the idea of being out in the middle of nowhere, but when you've been working non-stop for months, you'll take just about any opportunity to get away. My boss was on my back about vacation days, practically begging me to take some time off, so I figured, why not? A few days in a cabin, far away from the noise and stress of everyday life, seemed like a decent plan. It wasn't even my cabin. I got it from a buddy who owed me a favor. He'd inherited it from his uncle and told me I could use it whenever I wanted. "It's quiet up there," he said. "Great place to clear your head." The cabin was deep in the woods, about a 4-hour drive from the nearest city. It had no internet, no cell service, and barely any electricity. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the isolation, but I figured it might do me some good. So I packed my bags and headed out on a Friday morning. The drive up was long, winding through narrow roads that seemed to get more desolate the farther I went. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to set, casting an eerie orange glow over the dense trees that surrounded the place. The cabin itself was small and rustic, just as my friend had described. It sat on a slight hill, with nothing but woods for miles around. It was a bit run down, peeling paint, moss growing on the roof, the windows cloudy with age. But it had a charm to it, like something out of an old postcard. I parked my car, grabbed my bag, and headed inside. The interior wasn't much different. A single room with a tiny kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and a small bed in the corner. There was a bathroom off to the side, but no shower, just a rusted clawfoot tub. The place smelled faintly of dust and damp wood, like no one had been there for years. I settled in, unpacked a few things, and made a quick meal from the groceries I'd brought with me. After eating, I lit a fire on the stove and sat down with a book, trying to unwind. The silence was almost deafening. No cars, no distant hum of city life, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake this strange feeling of unease. It was like I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was miles from anyone. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the unfamiliar setting getting to me. But there was something about the way the cabin sat in the middle of those dark woods that made me feel watched. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would take my mind off things. But that feeling of being watched only grew stronger as the night deepened. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound that sent a chill down my spine, a slow, rhythmic tapping coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch hitting the side of the cabin, blown by the wind. But as I lay there listening, I realized it was too deliberate, too measured. It was like someone was lightly knocking on the walls, circling the cabin. I sat up in bed, straining to hear more. The tapping continued, moving from one wall to the next, like whoever or whatever was out there was testing the structure, feeling its way around. My heart started racing. I didn't want to move, didn't want to go to the window to see what it was. The logical part of my brain told me it was nothing, just an animal, maybe a raccoon or some other woodland creature. But the longer it went on, the harder it was to convince myself of that. After what felt like an eternity, the tapping stopped. I held my breath, waiting for it to start again, but all I could hear was the wind in the trees. I eventually fell back asleep, though it wasn't a restful sleep. The next morning I woke up feeling groggy and uneasy. The tapping from the night before lingered in my mind, but I tried to shrug it off. I spent most of the day exploring the woods around the cabin, trying to distract myself. The fresh air helped, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. As the sun began to set again, that sense of dread returned. I wasn't looking forward to another night in the cabin. I debated driving back home, but it was already getting dark, and the thought of navigating those narrow, winding roads at night didn't appeal to me. So, I made myself some dinner, lit another fire, and tried to settle in for the evening. Around midnight, just as I was starting to drift off, the tapping came back. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It moved faster, circling the cabin again. My pulse quickened. I got out of bed and grabbed the flashlight I'd packed, hesitating for a moment before moving to the window. I didn't want to look outside, didn't want to see what might be out there, but I needed to know. I slowly pulled back the curtain and shined the flashlight into the woods. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But just as I was about to step away from the window, I saw something. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but in the beam of the flashlight, I could make out a shape, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the shadows. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away. The figure didn't come closer, didn't retreat. It just stood there like it was waiting for something. My hands shook as I dropped the curtain and backed away from the window. I stumbled over to the stove and threw a few more logs on the fire, trying to push the cold, creeping fear out of my mind. The tapping had stopped, but I knew it wasn't over. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, clutching the flashlight, my back to the wall, listening for any sound. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made me jump, but the tapping didn't return. When morning finally came, I didn't waste any time. I packed my things, locked the cabin, and got the hell out of there. I never went back to that cabin, and I never told my friend what happened. I didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to think about it, but even now, sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I can still hear it just outside my window. And I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, waiting. It all started as a simple weekend away. I'd been working nonstop for months, and my buddy Jeff had been on my case to take a break. He suggested his family's old cabin out in the mountains, a secluded place where we could go hiking, drink a few beers, and just unplug from the world for a bit. The cabin had been in Jeff's family for decades, built by his grandfather in the 1960s. He'd spent a good portion of his childhood up there, but in recent years it had fallen out of use. Jeff had mentioned wanting to fix it up, and he figured this trip could be the perfect opportunity for a little DIY while we enjoyed some downtime. It sounded like a good plan. A few of us, a case of beer, and the quiet of the mountains. We set out on a Friday afternoon, me, Jeff, and two other guys from work, Mark and David. The drive up was long, and the last hour was spent on a narrow, twisting road that seemed to lead us deeper and deeper into the wilderness. By the time we pulled up to the cabin, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the thick forest surrounding the place. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. It sat on a slight hill, overlooking a small valley that dipped into the forest. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and the roof sagged a bit from years of neglect. But it had charm, the kind of rustic charm that made you feel like you were stepping back in time. Inside it was pretty bare, a couple of old couches, a fireplace, a small kitchen that looked like it hadn't been used in a decade. There were 2 bedrooms in the back, both with creaky old beds. We tossed our bags in one room and decided to bunk together for the weekend. No need to spread out in a place like this. We cracked open some beers and got a fire going in the fireplace. The first few hours passed uneventfully. We joked, laughed, and caught up on things outside of work. As the night wore on, we settled in, the sound of the fire crackling and the wind gently rustling the trees outside. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. I remember lying in bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. The isolation was nice, the kind of peace you don't realize you need until you get it. At some point, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up a few hours later to the sound of something tapping on the window. At first, I thought it was a dream. I lay there for a minute, eyes closed, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it. But then it came again, slow and deliberate, like someone gently rapping their knuckles against the glass. I opened my eyes and stared at the window. The curtains were drawn, but the sound was unmistakable. I lay there frozen, listening. The tapping continued for another minute or so, then stopped. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, but nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was probably a tree branch brushing against the window in the wind, and I managed to fall back asleep. The next morning, I didn't mention it to the others. It seemed trivial, and besides, I wasn't even sure it had happened. We spent the day hiking, exploring the nearby trails, and enjoying the fresh mountain air. The cabin was miles from anywhere, and it felt good to be away from the noise of the city. That night, after another round of beers and some grilling on the porch, we headed inside as the temperature dropped. We had another fire going, and as the flames flickered, Jeff started telling stories from his childhood. How his grandfather used to take him fishing in the nearby stream, how they'd hunt for deer in the woods, and how his grandmother always said the mountains had a soul of their own. It was around 1 a.m. when we decided to head to bed. As I lay down, I found myself thinking about the tapping from the night before. I glanced at the window, but it was quiet outside. The wind had died down, and the night was still. I don't know what woke me up this time, but when I opened my eyes, the room was pitch black. For a moment, I just lay there, trying to figure out what had stirred me. That's when I heard it again. This time, it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the front door. I sat up in bed, my pulse racing. I glanced over at Jeff and the others, but they were still asleep. The tapping came again, slow and deliberate. It didn't sound like knocking, more like someone lightly rapping on the wood with their knuckles, just loud enough to be heard, but not forceful enough to wake everyone else. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, my heart thudding in my chest. The cabin was cold, the fire in the fireplace having long since died down. I tiptoed to the front door, every creak of the floorboards sounding impossibly loud in the silence. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but something told me not to open it. Instead, I leaned in, pressing my ear to the wood. For a few seconds, there was nothing, just silence. And then, from the other side of the door, I heard a voice. It was low, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. A woman's voice, soft and melodic, speaking in a language I didn't understand. The words were muffled, but the tone was calm, almost soothing. I stepped back, my mind racing. There was no way anyone could be out there. We were miles from the nearest town, and it was the middle of the night. But the voice continued, that same gentle murmur, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side of the door was waiting for me to open it. I didn't. Instead, I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the door, half expecting it to swing open on its own. The voice stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving only the eerie silence of the cabin. I crawled back into bed, my heart still pounding, and lay awake for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told Jeff and the others about what had happened. Jeff didn't laugh it off the way I expected him to. Instead, he looked uncomfortable, like he'd heard something similar before. Mark and David tried to brush it off as my imagination, but Jeff didn't say anything. He just looked at the door, his brow furrowed in thought. We packed up and left that afternoon. We never spoke about it again. The idea to work remotely from a cabin was mine. I needed to escape from the constant noise of the city, the relentless emails, and the never-ending deadlines. Plus, I thought it would be a peaceful change of pace. A small, rustic place in the middle of nowhere, just me and my laptop. I'd get my work done, recharge, and come back feeling refreshed. It was the perfect plan, or so I thought. I found the cabin online through a random rental website. The pictures showed a simple wooden structure, surrounded by dense trees and perched near a lake. The description boasted complete isolation, no neighbors for miles, and no cell service. It sounded perfect for a weekend of focused work without distractions. The drive out there was long and uneventful. As I got closer to the cabin, the road became rougher and my GPS started glitching, showing me driving in the middle of nowhere. I shrugged it off, knowing that I was heading into a remote area. That was the whole point, after all. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the forest. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, a small one-room building with a porch overlooking the trees and the lake beyond. I unpacked my things, settled in, and set up my laptop on the small wooden table near the window. I felt a sense of peace wash over me as I looked out at the quiet surroundings. This was exactly what I needed. I worked for a few hours, the sound of typing and the occasional crackle of the fireplace, the only noise around. By the time the sun set, I was feeling productive, almost optimistic. I made some dinner, poured myself a glass of wine, and relaxed on the couch. That's when I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, a rustling noise coming from outside. I froze, listening carefully. It could have been an animal, I thought. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. The cabin was surrounded by woods, after all. But the sound grew louder, more distinct, like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving just outside the window. I stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The forest was thick, and the night was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the moon. I couldn't see anything. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination getting the best of me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there watching. I closed the curtains and locked the door, then sat back down at the table, trying to focus on my work. But the feeling of unease lingered. Every small noise, the wind rustling the leaves, the creak of the cabin's wooden frame, made my heart race. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see something staring back at me. Hours passed, and the noises eventually stopped. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that the isolation was messing with my mind. I decided to go to bed, hoping that a good night's sleep would help, but I didn't sleep well. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of tapping, soft, rhythmic taps, like someone was knocking on the walls of the cabin. I sat up in bed, my pulse quickening. The tapping continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other, as if someone or something was circling the building. My mind raced. There were no other people for miles, and I was the only one who had rented the place. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but of course, there was no signal. I cursed under my breath, realizing that I was completely cut off from the outside world. For a moment, I considered packing up and leaving right then and there, but I convinced myself that I was overreacting. Maybe it was an animal knocking on the walls. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe the sound stopped. For a few minutes, there was nothing but silence. I sat there in bed listening, my breath shallow, and then I heard it again, this time from the window. A slow, deliberate tapping on the glass. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was outside, but something in me forced my gaze toward the window. There was nothing, just the dark outline of the trees swaying in the night. But I knew I hadn't imagined the sound. Something had been there. I stayed frozen in bed for what felt like hours, waiting for the tapping to return, but it didn't. Eventually, I fell back into a restless sleep. The next morning, everything felt normal again. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and the unease I'd felt during the night seemed distant. I brushed it off as paranoia. The isolation was getting to me, that was all. I decided to focus on work and push through the rest of the weekend. But things only got worse from there. That evening, as I was typing away at my laptop, the power went out. The lights flickered once, twice, and then everything went dark. I cursed under my breath, fumbling for my phone to use it as a flashlight. The cabin had a backup generator, but I didn't know how to turn it on. I stood up, the small beam from my phone cutting through the darkness. That's when I noticed something, the door. It was open, just slightly ajar, as if someone had pushed it open from the outside. I hadn't touched the door since I'd locked it the night before. My blood ran cold. I slowly walked over to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed it shut, locking it again, and backed away. My mind was racing. Was someone out there? Had they been in the cabin while I was working? I grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter, holding it tight as I sat back down at the table. The silence was deafening. My phone battery was draining quickly, and I had no way to charge it with the power out. I sat there in the dark, knife in hand, waiting for something to happen. For hours, there was nothing, just the sound of the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin. I kept glancing at the door, expecting it to swing open at any moment. And then, just as my phone was about to die, the power came back on. The lights flickered back to life, and the sudden brightness was almost blinding. I blinked, disoriented but relieved. I set the knife down and tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that I was safe. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the night on edge, barely sleeping, listening for any sound that might indicate someone, or something, was outside. But the night passed without incident. The next day, I packed my things and left. I didn't care about finishing my work. I didn't care about the peaceful weekend I'd planned. I just needed to get out of there. As I drove away from the cabin, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing on the porch, watching me leave. But when I blinked, it was gone. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. I'd been dreaming of owning a cabin in the woods for years. A place to escape, to disconnect from the world and recharge. I wasn't one of those city people who couldn't handle silence or solitude. I craved it. The constant noise, the endless stream of emails, and the 9-to-5 grind had worn me down to the point where I felt like I was suffocating. So when I found an old cabin for sale at a price that seemed too good to be true, I jumped on the opportunity. The listing showed a cozy, weathered cabin nestled in the woods near a small lake. The pictures were a bit grainy, but the place looked perfect. The real estate agent told me it had been owned by a couple who had passed away, and their son was eager to sell it quickly since he lived out of state. There wasn't much information on the property itself, but the price was unbeatable, and I convinced myself it was a sign. The moment I set foot on the property, something felt off. The cabin itself looked a bit older than I expected, more rundown, like it had been abandoned for longer than the real estate agent had suggested. The windows were streaked with grime, and the wooden boards creaked underfoot as I approached the front door. The trees surrounding the place were thick, their branches casting long shadows over the roof, blocking out most of the sunlight. Still, I chalked it up to my nerves. I was finally making my dream come true. Of course, I'd feel a little apprehensive. It was a big step. I closed on the cabin in just a few days, signed the papers, and within a week, it was mine. I packed up my car and drove out there with some basic supplies, planning to spend my first weekend fixing it up and enjoying the peace. The first few hours were fine. I swept out the dust and cobwebs, replaced a couple of broken windows, and scrubbed the place down. The cabin had an old stone fireplace in the corner, a small kitchen area, and a loft for sleeping. It was rustic for sure, but it had potential. By the time the sun started to set, I had a fire going and was feeling pretty proud of myself. I sat down with a beer and watched the flames flicker, enjoying the sound of crackling wood and the wind rustling through the trees outside. That's when I heard it, the faintest whisper of a sound just outside the window. I froze, listening closely. It was hard to make out at first, but it sounded like someone walking through the underbrush. Slow, deliberate steps, like they were trying not to be heard. I stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the growing darkness. The trees were thick, and the light from the fire barely reached past the edge of the porch. I couldn't see anything, but the footsteps continued. They were getting closer. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, a deer or a fox maybe, but the steps were too measured, too heavy. I could feel my pulse quicken as I locked the door and drew the curtains. The sound stopped abruptly. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, listening for any sign that someone or something was out there. But after a few minutes, the footsteps didn't return. I let out a shaky breath and tried to laugh it off. I was letting my imagination run wild. That's what happens when you're alone in the woods, right? I forced myself to relax, but the unease stayed with me throughout the night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, every distant rustle made me jump. I barely slept. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I wanted to get a better sense of the property and reassure myself that there was nothing out there but trees and wildlife. I hiked through the woods for a while, following the trail that led down to the lake. The air was crisp, and the sunlight filtering through the trees was calming. For a while, I felt like I was finally starting to settle in, but as I made my way back to the cabin, I noticed something that stopped me dead in my tracks. There were footprints in the dirt, human footprints, and they weren't mine. The prints were fresh, leading from the edge of the woods right up to the cabin's front porch. My stomach churned as I crouched down to examine them. They were large, too big to be from anyone I knew. And worse, they were leading back into the woods, back the way I'd just come. I stood up, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The forest was still unnervingly quiet, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me and drawing all the curtains. I told myself it was probably a hunter or someone who had wandered onto the property by mistake. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Those footprints had been deliberate. Someone had been here. For the rest of the day, I tried to keep myself busy. I cleaned, rearranged some of the furniture, and made a half-hearted attempt at fixing a broken step on the porch. But the feeling of being watched never left me. Now and then, I'd hear faint noises outside, the crunch of leaves, the snap of a branch. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing there. As night fell, the cabin seemed to close in around me. The walls felt too thin, the darkness outside too thick. I built another fire, hoping it would calm my nerves, but the flickering light only seemed to deepen the shadows. I decided to call it a night early, hoping that sleep would come easier this time. I climbed into the loft, pulled the blankets up to my chin, and closed my eyes. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, heavy, circling the cabin. My blood turned to ice. I lay there, completely still, my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps stopped at the door. Then came the softest, most horrifying sound I'd ever heard. The doorknob rattling, as if someone was testing it. I bolted upright, my mind racing. The door was locked. I was sure of it. But the rattling continued, persistent and deliberate, followed by a long, low creak as the door slowly swung open. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Something was in the cabin with me. The footsteps echoed through the room as whatever it was crossed the floor. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to do anything but listen as it moved closer and closer until it was right beneath the loft. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting, listening to my ragged breathing. Eventually, I mustered the courage to peek over the edge of the loft. The cabin was empty. The door was wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. I didn't stay to find out what had been there. I grabbed my keys, bolted out the door, and drove away as fast as I could. I haven't been back since, and I never will. Owning a cabin was my dream, but now it's my nightmare. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. A chance for me, my girlfriend Lily, and two of our closest friends, Jake and Sarah, to escape the stress of everyday life and enjoy a few days in nature. Jake had found a cabin rental deep in the woods, far away from the noise of the city. It was located off an old dirt road, a couple of hours from the nearest town. It sounded exactly like what we needed. We packed up my car and set out on the road early Friday afternoon. The drive was long but enjoyable, full of laughter and good music. We passed through small towns and miles of dense forest, feeling more and more isolated as we went. That's what we wanted, though. No distractions, no cell service, just the four of us and the wild outdoors. As we got closer to the cabin, the paved roads turned into narrow gravel paths that seemed to wind endlessly through the woods. Jake had the directions saved on his phone, and according to him, we were almost there. But the deeper we drove, the more uneasy I started to feel. The trees grew taller, their branches arching over the road like a tunnel, blocking out the setting sun. Finally, after what felt like hours of driving through the forest, we pulled up to the cabin. It was smaller than I expected, a weathered wooden structure surrounded by nothing but trees. The cabin had a sagging roof and faded paint like it hadn't been used in years. But we didn't care. We were tired and just wanted to settle in. "Looks cozy," Sarah said with a nervous laugh as we grabbed our bags and headed inside. The interior wasn't much better. The furniture was old and covered in a thin layer of dust, and the air smelled musty, like the place had been closed up for too long. Still, it had everything we needed: a small kitchen, a couple of bedrooms, and a living room with a fireplace. "This place has character," Jake joked, trying to lighten the mood. We unpacked, lit a fire in the fireplace, and opened a few beers. The mood lifted as the night wore on, and we spent the evening talking and laughing around the fire. It was almost perfect, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. Something about the isolation, the stillness outside, the way the trees loomed over the cabin like they were watching us. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. Lily and I took one of the bedrooms, while Jake and Sarah claimed the other. As I lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't help but feel like something was off. The wind howled through the trees outside, and every creak of the cabin made my heart race. I told myself it was just nerves. Being so far from civilization could do that to anyone. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a deer maybe, but the steps were too heavy, too deliberate. They moved slowly around the cabin, pausing now and then, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was listening. I nudged Lily awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She listened for a moment and then shook her head. "It's probably just a raccoon or something. Go back to sleep." I tried, but the footsteps continued. I lay there listening, my heart pounding. I didn't want to go outside and check, but every instinct in me was telling me that something was wrong. Finally, the footsteps stopped, and after a few tense minutes, I managed to drift back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to see if I could find any tracks. The ground was damp from the rain the night before, and sure enough, there were footprints, human footprints, leading around the cabin. They weren't from any of us. I hadn't heard anyone else get up in the night, and these prints were far too large to belong to either Sarah or Lily. I showed them to Jake, and his expression grew serious. "Maybe someone else is staying nearby," he suggested. "A hunter, maybe?" But we hadn't seen another house or cabin for miles. Whoever had made those prints had been right outside our door, in the middle of the night, and we had no idea why. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me from the tree line. The forest, which had once seemed peaceful, now felt oppressive, like it was closing in on us. That night, the footsteps returned. This time they were louder and more deliberate, circling the cabin over and over again. I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, listening as they moved closer and closer to the windows. I could hear heavy breathing, almost like whoever was out there was right outside. I grabbed Lily's hand, and she squeezed mine back, her face pale in the moonlight. We didn't say a word, too terrified to even whisper. The footsteps stopped again, just like the night before, but I couldn't bring myself to go outside and check. None of us slept well that night. The next morning, Jake and I went out to inspect the area. The footprints were back, this time more distinct, and there were more of them. Whoever was out there had been pacing around the cabin for hours. We didn't know what to make of it. We hadn't seen anyone or anything other than the footsteps, but the prints were undeniable. By the third night, the tension was unbearable. We'd barricaded the doors and locked all the windows, but still the footsteps came back. This time, they didn't stop. They circled the cabin relentlessly, pounding into the ground like they were trying to drive us mad. There was something deeply wrong about the way they moved. Too methodical, too patient. Jake finally snapped. "I'm going out there," he said, grabbing a flashlight and his hunting knife. "I can't take this anymore." Before we could stop him, he threw open the door and charged outside, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. We watched from the window as he moved toward the edge of the trees, shouting for whoever was out there to show themselves. But the woods swallowed his voice, and the flashlight flickered before going out entirely. We heard a sharp gasp and then nothing, just silence. "Jake!" Sarah screamed, running to the door. I pulled her back before she could run outside. "We can't go out there. It's not safe." We waited for what felt like hours, but Jake never came back. The footsteps had stopped, but the air felt thick with something unseen, something waiting. When dawn finally broke, I forced myself to go outside and look for Jake. I found his flashlight near the tree line, its batteries dead, but there was no sign of him. His tracks led into the woods, but they stopped abruptly, as if he had vanished into thin air. We packed up and left the cabin that morning, leaving Jake behind. None of us spoke on the drive home, the weight of what had happened hanging over us like a storm cloud. I never found out what was out there, what had taken Jake. All I know is that something was watching us that weekend, something that didn't want us there. I sold the cabin as soon as I got home and swore I'd never go back. Last fall, my cousin Aaron invited me and a couple of friends to spend a weekend at his family's cabin. It was tucked away deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a 3-hour drive from the nearest town, and completely isolated. The perfect place, he said, to unwind and disconnect from everything. I'd been stressed from work, so it sounded like exactly what I needed. A quiet weekend with no cell service, no emails, just the mountains, and a few beers. We were a group of 4. Me, Aaron, my girlfriend Melissa, and Aaron's friend Brian. Melissa had been a bit hesitant about the idea of going so deep into the wilderness, but she trusted me when I told her it would be fun. Besides, Aaron had been to the cabin dozens of times growing up. He knew the place inside and out, and according to him, it was the perfect spot to get away from it all. The drive was long and winding, and as we climbed higher into the mountains, the roads narrowed and the trees grew denser. It was late afternoon by the time we arrived, and the sun was starting to dip behind the peaks. The cabin itself was rustic but charming, a small one-story building with a sloping roof and a wide porch. The forest surrounded it, so thick that it felt like the trees were pressing in on us. "It's even better than I remember," Aaron said as he unlocked the door. He seemed excited to show us around, pointing out the old wood stove, the hunting trophies on the walls, and the single bedroom with 2 creaky bunk beds. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it had everything we needed. That first night was peaceful. We sat around a fire pit outside, drinking and talking while the stars blinked into view above us. It was so quiet, almost unnervingly so. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. There wasn't a single house for miles, and I remember thinking how strange it felt to be so cut off from the rest of the world. As the fire died down, we decided to turn in for the night. Aaron and Brian took the bunks in the bedroom, while Melissa and I set up our sleeping bags in the main living area near the fireplace. We fell asleep to the soft glow of the embers and the gentle creaks of the cabin settling into the cold night. At some point I woke up. It was still dark, but something had pulled me out of my sleep. I couldn't figure out what it was at first, maybe the wind or an animal moving outside, but the silence was different, heavy. I strained my ears, but I couldn't hear anything. The wind had stopped, and the cabin was deathly still. I sat up, feeling a sudden wave of unease wash over me. Melissa was still asleep beside me, her breathing steady. I glanced at the door, and that's when I noticed something strange. The front door was cracked open. I knew for a fact that Aaron had locked it before we went to bed. I remembered him doing it, double-checking that the bolt was secure. I stood up, heart pounding, and quietly moved toward the door. The hinges creaked softly as I pushed it open wider, stepping out onto the porch. The air was cold, and the forest was pitch black, the trees looming like dark figures against the sky. I couldn't see anything beyond the porch, but I had the distinct feeling that something was out there, just beyond the tree line, watching. Suddenly, a loud snap echoed through the woods, a branch breaking. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound had come from the forest, maybe 50 feet away, but I couldn't see anything through the thick underbrush. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything, to emerge from the darkness. But nothing did. After a few minutes, I retreated inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I mentioned what had happened to Aaron, but he brushed it off, saying it was probably just a raccoon or a deer that had nudged the door. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there. We spent the day hiking through the woods, exploring the nearby streams and valleys. The scenery was beautiful, but the further we ventured from the cabin, the more isolated I felt. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, and the trail we followed was faint and overgrown. At one point, we stumbled upon an old hunting blind, an elevated platform built into the trees, long abandoned. The wood was rotting, and the ladder was missing rungs, but something about it gave me the creeps. It felt like we were trespassing, like we were in a place we shouldn't be. That night, things got worse. We had another fire going outside, and I was starting to feel more relaxed. But around midnight, just as we were about to head inside, we heard it. Loud footsteps in the woods. Not the light scurrying of animals, but heavy, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking through the underbrush. We all froze, listening. The footsteps grew louder and closer, and then they stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I scanned the darkness, trying to see what was out there. "Who's there?" Aaron called out, his voice shaky. No answer. For a long minute, we stood there, straining our ears, waiting for the footsteps to start again. But they didn't. The woods were silent once more, as if nothing had happened. "Let's go inside," Brian muttered, already backing toward the cabin. We all agreed, hastily putting out the fire and locking ourselves inside. We barricaded the door with a chair, just in case. No one wanted to admit it, but we were all scared. Whatever had made those footsteps wasn't a deer, and it wasn't some harmless animal. Someone or something was out there watching us. Around 3 a.m. I woke up again. This time it wasn't because of a noise. It was because of a feeling, an overwhelming sense of dread. I lay there, staring up at the dark ceiling, trying to calm my racing thoughts. That's when I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the outside wall of the cabin. It started near the front door and slowly moved along the side of the cabin, heading toward the back. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I nudged Melissa awake, and she sat up, wide-eyed. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, her face pale. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was circling the cabin. Then it stopped, right outside the window next to our sleeping bags. I didn't dare move. I didn't even breathe. Melissa clutched my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. We waited, hearts in our throats, for what felt like hours. But nothing happened. When morning finally came, we packed up as fast as we could and left without a word. None of us talked about what we'd heard or seen, but we all knew that something was out there in those woods. Something that wasn't human. We never went back. It was my friend Eric's idea to spend the weekend at the cabin. He found it online, dirt cheap. I should have known better. When something looks too good to be true, it probably is. But after months of burnout at work, the thought of a quiet escape to the mountains sounded perfect. Just a few of us. Eric, his girlfriend Sarah, me and my girlfriend Chloe. 4 friends in a remote, picturesque cabin with no responsibilities for 3 days. The drive out there was long and winding, and the further we went, the less populated the area became. The road narrowed, flanked by thick trees on either side. The air grew cooler as we climbed, and I began to feel a creeping unease that I couldn't explain. Chloe sat next to me in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the passing scenery, but she didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary. Eventually, we found the cabin, nestled in a hollow between 2 tall hills. It looked old but sturdy, with dark wood siding and a stone chimney that curved up into the sky. The surrounding forest loomed over it, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in the late afternoon sun. Something about the place felt off, but I chalked it up to being in such an isolated spot. Eric and Sarah were already there when we arrived. They waved from the porch, beers in hand, looking relaxed. We unpacked quickly and settled in, but as soon as I walked inside, I felt the cabin's age in the air. There was a musty smell, like damp wood and something else I couldn't quite place. The interior was small and cozy but dark, with mismatched furniture that looked like it had been there for decades. As the sun set, the 4 of us sat around the fireplace, which Eric had lit. We cracked open some drinks, played cards, and laughed about work, relationships, and whatever else came to mind. By the time it was fully dark outside, the unease I'd felt earlier had dulled to a distant thought. It wasn't until later that night, when everyone else was asleep, that things started to feel wrong. I woke up around 2 a.m. At first I thought it was because of the creaking floorboards. The cabin was old, after all, and old places make noises. But as I lay there in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, I realized that the sound wasn't just random settling. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like footsteps. I glanced at Chloe beside me, but she was sound asleep. The footsteps seemed to move from one end of the cabin to the other, slow and heavy, as if someone was pacing. I listened intently, trying to figure out if it was Eric or Sarah, but something about the sound was different, heavier. My heart started to race as the footsteps got closer to our bedroom door. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, and the footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, from outside the window, I heard a soft tapping. It was so light that I thought I might have imagined it at first. But then it came again, right on the glass, inches from where I sat frozen. I looked over at Chloe, still fast asleep, and then slowly turned toward the window. The moonlight was dim, but I could see the silhouette of someone, standing just beyond the glass. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I didn't want to move. I didn't even want to breathe. The figure outside didn't move, didn't make a sound other than that gentle tapping. I forced myself to look away and down at my phone, but of course, there was no signal out there. No way to call for help, no way to even check the time other than the faint glow of the screen. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the dark shape outside the window. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. But eventually, the tapping stopped, and the figure seemed to fade back into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, listening to the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin, hoping that whatever I'd seen was gone for good. In the morning, I didn't mention it to anyone. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I figured I must have been half asleep, imagining things. But when we all went outside after breakfast to explore the woods, I couldn't help but glance back at the window where I'd seen the figure. Nothing was there. The day passed uneventfully. We hiked a nearby trail, took some pictures of the mountains, and sat by a small creek that ran through the hollow. But even in the daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept catching movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows flickering between the trees, like someone was watching us. Chloe noticed my unease. She asked me if I was all right, and I lied, telling her I was just tired. I didn't want to ruin the trip for everyone. That night, after another long evening by the fire, we all went to bed again. I wasn't expecting to sleep much, and sure enough, it wasn't long before I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling. This time, I didn't hear footsteps, but as I lay there in the darkness, a soft noise broke the silence, whispering. Faint, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. I couldn't make out any words, but it sounded like a conversation between two voices, one deep and slow, the other higher, quicker. I strained to listen, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, but the more I focused, the clearer it became. The voices were coming from inside the cabin. Suddenly I heard a door creak. Not our bedroom door, but somewhere else in the cabin. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. Chloe stirred beside me, but didn't wake up. I stood up and quietly moved toward the door, pressing my ear against the wood. The whispers stopped. There was a long stretch of silence, and then, from the living room, I heard the faint sound of something scraping across the floor. I don't know what possessed me to open the door, but I did. I stepped into the hallway, the air colder than it had been before. The living room was dark, the only light coming from the faint embers of the dying fire. My eyes adjusted to the gloom, and that's when I saw it. A figure crouched low near the fireplace, dragging one of the old wooden chairs across the floor. I froze, unable to move. The figure's back was to me, its hunched form barely human, more like a shadow made solid. Slowly it turned its head toward me, and I saw its face, pale, sunken with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. I backed up, my hands trembling, and without thinking I slammed the bedroom door shut. The noise woke Chloe with a start, and she sat up, confused and scared. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We need to leave," I whispered, my heart racing. "Now, we didn't pack. We didn't grab our things. We just ran, out of the bedroom, through the cabin, and out into the cold night air." The car was parked at the edge of the clearing, and we didn't stop running until we were inside, locking the doors behind us. I floored it, speeding down the dark, winding road, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see that figure chasing us through the woods. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the trees, silent and still. We never talked about what happened that night. Not with each other, not with Eric and Sarah. We drove back to the city in silence, and that was the end of it. We never went back to that cabin, and we never will. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. A cozy cabin in the woods, miles from civilization, just my girlfriend Emma and me, spending a few days disconnected from the world. The kind of trip where you leave your phone behind, hike in the fresh air, and enjoy nights by the fireplace. We were exhausted from work and city life, and the idea of peace sounded like heaven. The drive took longer than expected. The directions from the cabin rental site led us deep into the mountains, down narrow, winding roads that seemed to go on forever. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was already setting, casting an eerie orange glow through the dense forest. The cabin itself was rustic. It looked older than in the pictures, weathered wood, windows fogged with dust, and a porch that creaked under our weight. But Emma seemed excited, so I brushed off the uneasy feeling creeping in. We unpacked quickly, eager to settle in. Inside, the cabin smelled musty, like it hadn't been used in years. The furniture was old but functional. A couple of wooden chairs, a small couch, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been lit in ages. Emma found some candles in a drawer and set them up, giving the place a warm glow. As night fell, the isolation became more apparent. The cabin was surrounded by nothing but trees, and the silence was unnerving. No cars, no distant hum of city life, just the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional creak from the cabin settling. Around 9 p.m. we decided to start a fire. We gathered some logs from a pile outside and lit the fireplace. The flames crackled, and the warmth was comforting, but something about the flickering shadows cast across the walls made me uneasy. I shook it off, blaming the long drive and the unfamiliar setting. We had just settled down on the couch, talking about hiking plans for the next day, when we heard it, a faint knock. It was so soft at first that I thought I imagined it, but then it came again, slightly louder. Emma froze, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Yeah," I replied, feeling a cold knot forming in my stomach. Maybe it's just the wind. But then it came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks came from the front door. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Stay here," I told Emma, grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen counter. Slowly, I made my way to the door. The knock came again, louder this time. I hesitated before unlocking the door, my hand trembling slightly as I turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. I shone the flashlight out onto the porch, sweeping it from left to right. There was no one there, no sign of movement, just the cold night air and the rustling of leaves. I stepped outside, the wooden boards of the porch creaking under my weight. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, revealing only trees and the dirt path leading back to the road. I called out, "Hello?" but my voice felt small in the vast emptiness. After a few tense moments of silence, I turned back to the cabin, shutting the door behind me. Emma was sitting on the couch, clutching a blanket, her face pale. "No one's there," I said, trying to sound calm. Probably just the wind. But I didn't believe it. Neither did she. We tried to brush it off, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside felt like something, or someone, was watching us. Emma suggested we call the owner, but our phones had no signal, and the cabin didn't have a landline. Typical. We decided to just head to bed early and hoped a good night's sleep would ease our nerves. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. The wind howled and the branches scraped against the windows, but underneath it all, I kept hearing something else. Faint, irregular knocking. At some point I must have dozed off, but I was jolted awake by a loud crash. Emma shot up beside me, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she whispered. I listened carefully. The sound had come from the living room. It was as if something had knocked over one of the chairs. "I'll check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and cautiously made my way to the living room. The fire had gone out and the room was dark, but nothing seemed out of place until I saw the front door. It was wide open. My heart raced as I swung the flashlight toward the door, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the porch was empty, and beyond it, the darkness of the woods seemed to stretch endlessly. I quickly shut the door, locking it this time, and double-checked the windows to make sure they were secure. When I returned to the bedroom, Emma was sitting up, her face pale. "The door was open," I said quietly, not wanting to panic her. "What do you mean it was open? Did you forget to lock it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm sure I locked it," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. But it was wide open. Neither of us slept after that. We stayed in the bedroom, listening to the strange noises that seemed to be growing louder. The knocking was no longer soft and irregular. It was deliberate, like someone was pounding on the walls of the cabin. Then there were footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps circling the cabin. I could feel the walls closing in, the oppressive silence of the woods amplifying the sounds outside. Emma clung to me, her body trembling with fear. Every instinct in me screamed to get out, but there was nowhere to go. We were miles from the nearest town, with no phone signal, no neighbors, and no way to reach help. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. But then the knocking started again. This time, it was coming from the bedroom window. My heart leaped into my throat as I turned